Every addiction treatment program built on shame has a lower success rate than one built on understanding. We've known this for decades. We keep building shame-based programs anyway, and here's why that needs to stop and what actually works instead. Shame has never made a single person sober. Let me say that to you again. Shame has never made a single person sober. Because what shame does, and this is not opinion, this is neuroscience, what shame does is drive people deeper into the very behaviors that they're ashamed of. And yet, if you've ever tried to stop drinking, stop using, or talk to someone about your substance use, you'll have encountered shame at almost every turn. In the way people look at you, in the way the system talks to you, in the way you talk to yourself at 3 a.m. And I would love to spend the next 10 to 12 minutes explaining what shame actually is and what it does to the brain, and why it's the primary reason that high achievers don't get help. And, probably more importantly, what the alternative looks like. This is one of the most important conversations in addiction treatment, and almost nobody is having it honestly. And why? So I'm going to start with the question, what is shame neurologically? Let's start with the science. Stay with me, it might get wordy. Because I think it's important to understand shame not as a feeling, but as a neurobiological state. Shame activates the same neural networks as physical pain. Brain imaging studies consistently show that social rejection and shame light up the anterior insula, which is the same region activated by physical injury. Your brain processes shame as a threat to survival. Why? Because for most of human evolutionary history, social exclusion was survival threatening. Being cast out of the group meant death. So the brain treats shame with the same urgency as a physical wound. When shame is activated, the amygdala, which is your threat detection center, takes over. So the prefrontal cortex, your thinking and reasoning, decision-making brain, goes completely offline. You move into fight, flight, or freeze. And in the context of addiction, this means the moment you feel shame about your substance use, you lose access to the very cognitive capacity you need to make a different choice. Shame doesn't create reflection. Shame creates reactivity. And the fastest way to regulate that reactivity is to turn the amygdala alarm off. So it's to use, basically. This is not irony either. This is neurobiology. Shame about using makes you more likely to use. Full stop. So let me move on to telling you about the shame loop in high achievers. For high achievers, shame operates with particular ferocity. And here's why. Your self-concept, so your internal model of who you are, is built substantially on competence, on being capable, on being the person who has it all together. Addiction, by its very nature, represents a loss of control. And for someone whose identity is built on control, that loss is not just uncomfortable, it is identity threatening. I've sat with so many CEOs who would sooner have declared bankruptcy than told their partner that they had a problem with cocaine. Hear that? Because I've worked with barristers, surgeons, hedge fund managers, solicitors, people who navigate extraordinary complexity with confidence every day, who are completely paralyzed by the shame of needing help with their drinking. The shame loop in a high achiever typically looks a little bit like this. Stage 1, using. Stage 2, perform well the next day, reinforcing the narrative that it's under control. Stage 3, experience a moment where the use causes a problem. A missed meeting, a difficult conversation, a moment of paranoia. Stage 4, intense shame. Stage 5, shame activates threat response, so the prefrontal cortex goes offline. Stage 6, use to regulate the shame. And we're back to stage 1. This loop can run for years, if not decades. The performance in stage 2 is the cruelest part, because it keeps the external feedback system from delivering you the truth, and it feeds the internal narrative that it's still manageable. Meanwhile, the loop tightens. The window of clarity gets shorter, the shame gets heavier, and the gap between the public self and the private reality gets much, much wider. Now, let me tell you why the treatment system gets this wrong. This is just an opinion, guys, but stay with me for this because it feels really important. And I want to be honest about the treatment landscape for a moment. my experience, because a significant proportion of traditional addiction treatment still relies implicitly or explicitly on shame as a motivator. So the language of rock bottom, the concept that someone must lose everything before they're ready. Confrontational interventions designed to force acknowledgement, moral inventories that frame addiction as character deficiency. And I want to be clear, many people in these programs recover. In fact, it was a huge part of my recovery. But the human capacity for recovery is remarkable and not confined to any one model. And that includes ours. But the research is consistent. Shame-based approaches have higher dropout rates. They have lower long-term abstinence rates, and they have poorer outcomes for co-occurring mental health conditions, which are present in almost all of the people that I see with addiction issues. And they are particularly poorly suited to high-achieving individuals for whom shame is not a motivator but a barrier, because the high achiever has so much more to protect. More reputation on the line, more identity investment in not being someone who has a problem. And the approach that the research consistently supports is something really, really different. It's called compassion-focused therapy, or in broader terms, a self-compassion framework. It starts from the principle that change is more likely when someone feels understood than when they feel judged. Sounds simple, right? That the path to accountability runs through empathy, not humiliation. The understanding, and that understanding is why the behaviour developed, its functioning, its logic, its roots, is more therapeutically powerful than cataloguing its damage. This is not soft per se either. I don't work in a soft way personally. This is evidence-based. And for high achievers especially, it is the difference between engagement and avoidance. So, I can hear you asking what replaces shame then? So if shame is out, what replaces it? Great question. 3 things, and I'm going to be really, really specific. The first is understanding. Not excuse making, but understanding. Understanding that addiction is a neurobiological response to a combination of genetic predisposition, environmental stress, trauma history, and opportunity too. Understanding that the substances served a function. They regulated something that needed regulating. They provided something that wasn't available elsewhere. Understanding this doesn't mean the behaviour was without consequence. It means the behaviour made sense at the time. And that matters because when something makes sense, you can start to work with it and even start to change it. When something is a moral failure, you can only hide from it. The second is accountability without self-punishment. There is a critical distinction between taking responsibility and self-flagellation. Responsibility said, this happened, there were consequences, I need to address those consequences and make different choices next time. Self-punishment says, I am fundamentally broken, I deserve to suffer, I am not worthy of a different life. Brackets, shame. One of those moves you forward, the other keeps you locked in the loop. And for high achievers, learning to hold themselves accountable without destroying themselves in the process is often one of the most significant pieces of therapeutic work that I do, that we do. Because the standards you hold yourself to professionally often come with punitive internal voices that have no business anywhere near a recovery process. I'm sorry to say it, but there's a big change that needs to happen there. The third thing that replaces shame is curiosity. Instead of what is wrong with me, ask, what was I trying to do? What was I trying to feel? Or in a lot of cases, what was I trying to not feel? What need was this meeting that I haven't found any other way to meet? These questions open doors. Shame slams them shut. Recovery at its best is a process of becoming genuinely curious about who you are. Not critical, but curious. And that curiosity, in my experience, is one of the most powerful things that high achievers have going for them. Because you know how to investigate. You know how to understand complex systems. That capability, turned inward with compassion rather than judgment, is extraordinary. So before we finish, shame has never made a single person sober, but understanding has, compassion has, curiosity has. If you have been using shame as your primary motivation to change and it hasn't worked, that is not evidence that you're beyond help. It is evidence that shame was never the right tool in the first place. You deserve an approach that treats you as a complex human being, not a moral failure to be corrected. That's what recovery actually looks like. Please follow this channel. Share this with anyone who needs to hear that they're not broken. A powerful sentence that is. And if you're ready to do the real work, reach out, because our door is open and it will stay open, because shame does not live here.